11 altar boys vanished in 1980, 26 years later FBI exhumed the priest's coffin. In the summer of 1980, the little town of St. Mary's had the kind of peaceful charm people wrote about in postcards. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where children played in open fields until the sun dipped low, and where the church stood tall at the center of the community. The church bell rang every Sunday morning, calling families together, and its sound echoed through the quiet streets lined with small shops and houses that all seemed to wear the same friendly smile. Life was steady, safe, and familiar, or at least that was what people believed. Among the children in town, the altar boys of St. Mary's Church stood out. They were 11 in total, ranging in age from 9 to 14. They were bright, polite, and well loved by their families and neighbors. People often admired how neatly they dressed on Sundays, with their white robes, standing proudly beside the priest as part of the service. Their parents were proud, believing their children were learning discipline, respect, and a sense of duty from helping in the church. That summer, the boys could often be seen walking together in groups, carrying hymn books or playing near the churchyard after their duties were done. They shared laughter, secrets, and dreams about the future. For many of them, serving at the altar was more than just a task, it was a bond that tied them closely to one another. They felt important, as though they were doing something that truly mattered. The town admired them, and their faces were familiar at every gathering. At the heart of the church was Father Raymond Doyle. To the townspeople, he was a man of faith, respected and trusted. He had been serving there for years, guiding families through baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Many people saw him as a pillar of wisdom, someone they could turn to in difficult times. Parents often encouraged their sons to assist him, believing it would shape them into better men. His presence was reassuring, his sermons uplifting, and his reputation untouchable. Then, one warm evening in July, the town's peace began to unravel. It started quietly, almost unnoticeably. One boy did not return home after helping with evening prayers. At first, his parents thought he had stayed late with friends. The streets were safe, after all, and children often lingered outside during the long summer days. But as the hours stretched into night and he still had not returned, worry began to grow. Families searched the usual spots: the playground, the park, even the corner store. The boy was nowhere to be found. By the next morning, the sense of unease had spread. Another boy had failed to come home the night before. And then, shockingly, a third. Soon, parents were knocking on each other's doors, comparing notes, asking if anyone had seen their sons. Panic began to ripple through the community. 11 boys had disappeared, every single one of the altar boys. They were simply gone. The small police department, unprepared for something of this scale, launched a frantic search. Officers combed the fields, searched the church, and questioned neighbors. Flyers with the boys' photographs were posted on every street corner. Families gathered at the church, clinging to one another, hoping for answers. Mothers wept, fathers tried to stay strong, and siblings whispered fearful questions that had no answers. Rumors began to spread quickly. Some believed the boys had run away together, perhaps daring each other on some grand adventure. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting that someone had taken them. The church, once a place of comfort, suddenly became a place of unanswered questions. People asked where the boys had last been seen and who they had last spoken to. Eyes turned toward Father Doyle, but only for a moment. Most brushed away the thought immediately. He was a man of God, they said. He had baptized their children, prayed at their sick beds, and buried their loved ones. To question him felt almost like questioning faith itself. But still, questions lingered. Had he seen the boys that evening? Did he know where they might have gone? The priest answered calmly, saying he had dismissed them after prayers and assumed they had gone home. His words were steady, his expression unreadable, and though some felt uneasy, no one dared push further. Respect and fear kept doubts silent. The days turned into weeks, and the search grew desperate. The FBI was called in, and the story spread to newspapers beyond the town. Reporters arrived, cameras flashing, eager to capture the mystery of the missing altar boys. Interviews were given, tears were recorded, and headlines screamed the tragedy to the nation. But despite the attention, no trace of the boys could be found. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue. It was as though the earth had simply swallowed them whole. The families lived in torment. Every knock at the door made hearts leap with hope, only to sink again when no news came. Birthdays passed without candles being blown, Christmas mornings without the sound of laughter. Parents left the boys' bedrooms untouched, waiting for the day they might return. Some refused to move on, clinging to the belief that their sons were still alive somewhere. Others sank into quiet grief, their lives forever changed by the emptiness. And through it all, the church bell continued to ring. Father Doyle still gave his sermons, his voice calm and steady, urging faith and endurance. The townspeople listened, torn between their sorrow and their need to believe in something greater than themselves. The church was the only constant in the storm, and many clung to it, even as suspicion gnawed quietly in the corners of their minds. By the end of that summer, the case went cold. The FBI filed their reports, the police stored their boxes of notes, and the reporters moved on to new stories. The families remained, trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions. 11 boys had vanished, and the town that once seemed so safe was left haunted by a silence too heavy to bear. What no one knew then was that the answers lay much closer than anyone imagined. The truth was hidden, waiting, buried beneath layers of trust, faith, and fear. For the next 2 decades, the disappearance of the 11 altar boys would remain one of the most painful mysteries in the town's history. And all the while, the secret rested quietly, where no one thought to look. Time passed, and the painful mystery of the 11 altar boys slowly became a wound that the town carried quietly. At first, the search for them had been filled with energy and determination. Families clung to hope, neighbors offered support, and officials promised answers. But as the months dragged on without progress, the once busy search efforts began to slow. The flyers that had been bright and new now faded in the sunlight, peeling off lampposts and bulletin boards. People still spoke about the boys, but now in hushed voices, as though too much noise might make the sadness worse. By the mid-1980s, 5 years had passed. The parents of the boys still held on, but life in the town continued in its slow, steady rhythm. Shops opened each morning, the school bell rang each day, and weddings and funerals filled the church calendar. Still, the families of the missing boys never felt whole again. Some parents left the boys' bedrooms untouched, keeping them exactly as they had been on the last day. The beds remained neatly made, toys sat untouched, and school books stayed stacked on desks. Others found the silence too heavy and quietly packed away their sons' belongings, hoping that hiding the reminders would make life bearable. The church, meanwhile, continued to play its central role in the town. Father Doyle stood at the altar every Sunday, his calm voice echoing through the pews. He gave sermons about endurance, about patience, about trusting that someday answers would come. Many people found comfort in his words. For some, he was the reason they still managed to get up and face each day. For others, his presence was unsettling, though they could not explain why. They never said it out loud, but deep inside, doubts quietly stirred. Children who had once been the boys' classmates grew up with a strange emptiness in their memories. They remembered the laughter that had once filled the playground, the boys who had been the life of every game, but they never got to see them grow into teenagers or adults. It was as if time had frozen the altar boys at that one summer in 1980. The story of their disappearance became something whispered to new families who moved into town. It became a tale the older generation passed on to the younger ones, a story that felt more like a legend, even though it had been painfully real. By the early 1990s, the case had grown cold enough that it no longer made the news. Reporters stopped visiting, and even the FBI had shifted its focus to other pressing matters. Only the families still carried the weight in their hearts. On anniversaries, they would gather in front of the church, holding small vigils with candles that flickered against the night sky. Each parent prayed that one day the truth would come to light. But as more years passed, their prayers began to sound like echoes in an empty hall. When Father Doyle passed away in the late 1990s, the town gave him a grand funeral. People filled the church, remembering his long years of service and his dedication to the community. He was buried in the churchyard, not far from where he had once led children in Sunday school. For many, his death felt like the closing of a chapter. They spoke of him kindly, praised his devotion, and laid flowers on his grave. Yet in quiet corners, there were still whispers, unspoken questions that no one dared ask out loud. Some people remembered odd details, like the times he had been strangely protective of certain rooms in the church, or when he had taken long walks late at night. But these thoughts were always brushed aside. Respect for the church, and perhaps fear of being shunned, kept the town silent. The new priest who came after him found a congregation marked by loss but unwilling to speak of it. When he asked about the boys, he was told gently, "It's a sad story we don't talk about much." For him, it was a mystery he did not fully understand, and he focused instead on guiding the living rather than asking about the past. The years stretched on, and the missing boys became part of the town's history. For the younger generation, who had been born after 1980, the story was like a shadow from long ago. They heard it in pieces, in whispers at the back of the classroom or in stories told around bonfires. Some treated it like a ghost tale, something chilling but distant. Others could see the pain still etched in the faces of the parents who remained. Meanwhile, the families who had lost their sons aged with the heavy burden of not knowing. Some moved away, unable to face the constant reminders in every corner of town. Others stayed, holding on to the hope that one day they might learn the truth. They lived in two worlds: the ordinary rhythm of daily life, and the quiet ache of unanswered questions. As time passed, even the police officers who had once searched the fields and forests retired, their reports tucked away in dusty boxes in the archives. The case was officially unsolved, but for the parents, it was never closed. They still remembered every detail: the last words their sons had spoken, the way their hair had been brushed that morning, the sound of their laughter echoing in the backyard. Those memories stayed sharp, like photographs burned into their minds. By the year 2000, 2 whole decades had passed. The world outside the town had changed: new technology, new leaders, new ways of life. But in St. Mary's, the story of the 11 altar boys remained frozen in time. The town had learned to live with silence. No new clues had ever come, no one had been charged, and the boys had simply never returned. The mystery of their disappearance lingered like an unhealed wound. It was the kind of story that seemed destined never to be solved. People spoke less and less about it, but the weight of it never left. It sat quietly beneath the surface of the town, hidden behind polite smiles and Sunday services. What no one realized then was that the silence was only temporary. The truth, though buried, was still there, waiting. And when it finally came to light, it would shake the very foundation of everything the town believed in. It was the year 2006 when the town of St. Mary's suddenly found itself at the center of attention again. By then, more than 2 decades had passed since the altar boys had vanished, and many people believed the truth would never be known. The families had grown older, the younger generation hardly remembered the faces of the missing children, and the church stood quietly, carrying its history like an old scar. Yet, just when the town had settled into silence, a phone call changed everything. The call came from a hospital in a nearby city. A man named Thomas O'Leary, who had once worked at the church during the late 1970s and early 1980s, was gravely ill. His health was failing, and the doctors quietly admitted he had only days left. With the weight of time pressing down on him, he asked to speak to investigators. He wanted to tell them something he had carried in his heart for more than 2 decades. Something he had been too afraid to say before. When the FBI heard about his request, they sent 2 agents to his bedside. They expected perhaps a small detail, something minor he had remembered, but what Thomas revealed stunned them. In a weak but steady voice, he confessed that one night, long ago, he had seen Father Doyle in the churchyard. The priest had been moving something heavy, struggling in the dark. At first, Thomas thought it was just equipment or supplies, but he noticed how carefully the priest lowered it into the ground. The priest had looked startled when he realized someone was nearby. Thomas said he had felt a chill run through him, but at the time, he had convinced himself not to question it. After all, who was he to doubt the priest? For years, Thomas had carried that memory in silence. He had feared that no one would believe him, or worse, that speaking out would bring shame or anger upon him. But now, with little time left, he could not leave the world without unburdening his soul. He told the agents that he believed what he had seen was connected to the disappearance of the altar boys. The confession shook the FBI team. After so many years of silence, this was the first solid lead. They carefully took notes, asked questions, and recorded every detail. Thomas passed away just days later, leaving behind a statement that would reignite the case that had haunted St. Mary's for so long. The FBI reopened the investigation. Old files were pulled from storage, dusty boxes filled with photographs, reports, and maps. Agents who had once worked on the case were called back to give their recollections. New technology, especially forensic tools that hadn't existed in the 1980s, gave investigators hope that perhaps they could now uncover what had been hidden. When news of the reopened case reached the town, emotions swelled. For the families, it was both painful and hopeful. Some of them, now with gray hair and frail bodies, felt the weight of memory return. They had lived so long without answers, but now they wondered if closure was finally within reach. For others in the community, it stirred up uneasy feelings. People who had admired and defended Father Doyle now found themselves questioning their past trust. Whispers began again in grocery stores, at bus stops, and after Sunday Mass. The investigators began re-interviewing old witnesses. They spoke with townspeople who remembered odd details from that summer. Some recalled how the priest had been unusually tired during certain weeks, as though he had been carrying a heavy burden. Others remembered times when the church basement had been locked, even from those who usually had access. These fragments, which had seemed unimportant years ago, now began to look suspicious. The FBI also studied Father Doyle's background more closely. They traced his early years in the priesthood, his transfers between parishes, and his connections. While much of his record seemed ordinary, there were moments that raised questions. Why had he been moved quickly from one church to another early in his career? Why had certain complaints, though vague, been quietly dismissed? The deeper the agents dug, the more they realized how much had been overlooked in the past. Finally, after months of reviewing evidence and considering Thomas O'Leary's confession, the FBI made a bold decision. They would request to exhume Father Doyle's coffin. It was not an easy choice. Exhuming a priest's grave was sensitive and would draw strong reactions, especially from those who still saw him as a man of faith. But the agents believed it was the only way to uncover the truth. The request went through official channels. Court approvals were sought, legal arguments were made, and eventually, permission was granted. The announcement sent shockwaves through the town. Some residents supported it, desperate for answers. Others were outraged, calling it disrespectful to disturb a man's final resting place. Families of the missing boys, though torn, largely supported the decision. They had lived too long with silence and could no longer bear the weight of not knowing. As the date of the exhumation approached, tension filled the air. News outlets picked up the story once again, just as they had in the 1980s. Reporters arrived with cameras, eager to capture the unfolding drama. Old photographs of the 11 smiling altar boys reappeared on television screens, reminding everyone of the faces that had been lost. For younger generations, it was a chance to see the story their parents and grandparents had whispered about come alive again. The night before the exhumation, the town felt unusually quiet. Some people lit candles outside their homes, praying for truth and peace. Others stayed indoors, unsettled by what was to come. The families of the altar boys hardly slept. For them, this was more than just a legal process. It was a step toward finally learning what had happened to their children. The morning arrived gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low in the sky. The cemetery gates were lined with vehicles, FBI vans, police cars, and news trucks. Agents in plain clothes and uniforms stood side by side, their expressions serious. The townspeople gathered at a distance, some clutching rosaries, others holding photographs of the boys. Whispers spread through the crowd as workers prepared to dig. The coffin was carefully lifted from the earth, the sound of machinery breaking the silence. Every eye was fixed on the scene, every breath held in anticipation. For 26 years, the priest had rested undisturbed, his grave a symbol of reverence. Now, it had become the center of suspicion. The lid of the coffin remained closed, but everyone knew that soon it would be opened. Inside lay the possibility of answers or more questions. For the first time in decades, the truth felt close enough to touch. And though fear, anger, and sorrow swirled among the crowd, one thought united them all: whatever was hidden inside that coffin would finally begin to unravel the mystery that had haunted them for so long. The gray morning air hung heavy over the cemetery as the coffin of Father Doyle was placed carefully on the ground. A hush fell over the gathered crowd: neighbors, families of the missing altar boys, church members, and reporters who had rushed in to cover the story. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the simple wooden box that had rested beneath the soil for nearly a decade. It looked ordinary from the outside, but for those who had waited 26 years, it carried the weight of endless questions. The workers stood back as FBI agents stepped forward. They moved carefully, with solemn expressions, knowing the entire town was watching. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though nature itself wanted to hear the truth that was about to be uncovered. When the lid of the coffin was slowly pried open, the crowd leaned in, hearts pounding with anticipation. They expected to see the priest's remains lying quietly, just as anyone would after years of rest. But the moment the lid lifted, gasps rippled through the air. What lay inside was not what anyone had imagined. At first, there was confusion. The coffin did contain the priest, but beneath his body, carefully hidden, was something else: bundles wrapped tightly in old cloth. The agents exchanged looks, their training telling them this was no ordinary burial. They carefully lifted the coverings, layer by layer, revealing what the town had feared for decades: human remains that did not belong to the priest. The crowd stirred. Some people cried out, others covered their mouths in shock. The families of the altar boys clutched each other, tears welling in their eyes. Though nothing had yet been confirmed, deep inside, they already knew. The truth they had carried in their hearts for 26 years was beginning to surface. The FBI quickly secured the site. Reporters tried to capture photographs, but agents pushed them back, determined to treat the discovery with respect. Specialists were called in to carefully remove the remains and send them for testing. It would take weeks for forensic teams to confirm exactly who they belonged to, but in that moment, the families felt both devastation and relief. For so long, they had lived with silence. Now, finally, there was evidence. The news spread across the town like wildfire. Radios, televisions, and newspapers reported the discovery within hours. Coffin of parish priest yields shocking secret, one headline read. Missing altar boys mystery reopened, said another. Suddenly, the story that had once faded into quiet history was alive again, and not just in St. Mary's. The entire country was talking about it. The churchyard, once a place of peace, now became a symbol of unanswered questions. How could this have happened? How had a priest, a man trusted by everyone, managed to hide such a secret for so long? And how had no one noticed? The community, which had once defended his memory, now struggled with guilt and disbelief. Forensic experts worked day and night in their laboratories. Each bone, each fragment, was carefully examined. Slowly, answers began to emerge. The remains matched the ages of the boys who had disappeared. One by one, identities were confirmed. Families who had waited more than 2 decades received heartbreaking but undeniable news: their sons had been found. The discovery did not erase their pain, but it gave them something they had been denied for so long: truth. The FBI held press conferences, sharing updates with the public. Agents explained that the coffin had been used to conceal more than the priest's own burial. They spoke cautiously, avoiding speculation, but it was clear the evidence pointed to Father Doyle himself. Though he could no longer answer questions, the items uncovered told a silent story. Investigators found personal belongings mixed among the remains: small crosses, pieces of clothing, and trinkets that parents immediately recognized. These items, once held in the hands of children, had been buried beneath the priest's final resting place. The town was shaken to its core. People who had once spoken highly of Father Doyle now whispered in disbelief. Some admitted they had seen things that seemed unusual over the years but had never dared question him. Others felt betrayed, realizing the trust they had placed in him had shielded him from suspicion. The church walls, which had once echoed with songs of hope, now seemed to carry a heavy silence. Attendance at services dropped sharply. People no longer found comfort in the pews where they had once prayed. Instead, they looked at the altar with haunted eyes, remembering the children who had stood there proudly in white robes. For the families, the discovery was both a wound and a bandage. They finally had answers, but those answers carried unbearable sorrow. Many mothers wept openly, holding photographs of their sons close to their hearts. Fathers, who had tried to remain strong for so many years, broke down as memories of their children came rushing back. Yet, even through the tears, there was relief. At last, the mystery was no longer a mystery. The truth, painful as it was, had come out. The exhumation also brought national attention to the issue of trust and accountability. Experts, church officials, and community leaders began to question how such secrets could remain hidden for decades. News programs held discussions, and families from other towns shared similar stories of unanswered disappearances. The case of St. Mary's became more than just a local tragedy. It became a symbol of the importance of seeking truth, no matter how long it takes. In the weeks that followed, memorials were held for the boys. Vigils lit the night sky with candles, and their names were spoken aloud once again. For some families, it was the first time they could truly say goodbye. Though the years had stolen their chance to watch their sons grow up, they could now honor them properly, knowing the truth was no longer buried. The priest's coffin, once a resting place, had become a container of secrets. The discovery inside it reminded everyone that appearances can be deceiving, and that trust, when misplaced, can hide the darkest truths. The townspeople, though shaken, grew closer in their grief. Neighbors supported one another, offering meals, prayers, and shoulders to lean on. The families of the boys, though broken by loss, no longer carried the burden of uncertainty. The cemetery returned to silence after the investigators left, but it was a silence filled with awareness. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, people remembered the moment the coffin had been opened and the truth had finally come to light. The past could not be changed, but at least the shadows of doubt had been lifted. And though the story had taken 26 years to uncover, it was far from over. The aftermath, the questions of responsibility, the reckoning for the church, and the healing of the families was only beginning. The town of St. Mary's, once quiet and trusting, now carried a lesson written in its history, that truth may be buried for a time, but it will never stay hidden forever. The discovery inside Father Doyle's coffin had changed everything in the town of St. Mary's. For 26 years, people had lived with questions that had no answers. Now the truth had finally been uncovered, and it felt as though the ground beneath them had shifted. The silence that had once surrounded the disappearance of the altar boys was replaced with conversations that filled every street, every home, and every gathering place. Families who had suffered in silence now had confirmation of what their hearts had always feared. Mothers, who had once left their sons' bedrooms untouched in hope that they would someday return, now stood in those same rooms with tears in their eyes, knowing that the wait was over. Fathers, who had carried the weight of unanswered questions on their shoulders for decades, finally allowed themselves to grieve openly. Though the truth was painful, it gave them permission to mourn fully and honestly. The town itself felt divided. Some people struggled with anger, asking how they could have been so blind. Others wrestled with guilt for ever defending Father Doyle or dismissing their own doubts. The church, once the heart of the community, now stood as a place that reminded everyone of betrayal. Attendance at Sunday Mass fell sharply. Families who had once filled the pews with songs and prayers now chose to stay home, their faith shaken by what had been uncovered. The FBI continued its work, piecing together the final story. They studied the priest's life, reviewing documents, letters, and the testimony of people who had known him. Patterns began to emerge: moments of suspicion, transfers between parishes, decisions that now seemed deliberate. Investigators concluded that Father Doyle had used his trusted position to keep people from questioning him. His reputation had been a shield that allowed him to carry secrets without interference. Forensic experts presented their findings in detailed reports. The remains recovered from the coffin were identified as several of the altar boys who had gone missing in 1980. Personal belongings found with them confirmed their identities: small crosses, pieces of fabric from robes, and even a few personal trinkets that families instantly recognized. These items, though simple, carried deep meaning. Parents held them in their hands, whispering memories of the children who had once owned them. The revelations made national headlines. Television networks covered the story extensively, and newspapers across the country wrote about the small town and its long-hidden tragedy. Talk shows discussed the case, and experts debated how such secrets could have remained concealed for so long. The story of St. Mary's became more than a local matter; it became a symbol of the need for accountability, truth, and transparency in every institution. The Catholic Church, too, came under heavy scrutiny. Officials from the diocese released statements expressing sorrow and regret, acknowledging that the community had been deeply hurt. They promised investigations into how the case had been handled and how concerns about Father Doyle had been overlooked. For many townspeople, however, these words came too late. The damage was already done, and trust was not easily repaired. In the midst of all this, the families of the boys found ways to honor their children. Vigils were held in the churchyard, with candles lighting up the night. Memorial services brought people together, not only from St. Mary's but from surrounding towns as well. Songs were sung, prayers were spoken, and names that had been whispered for decades were once again said aloud in strong, steady voices. Each boy was remembered not for the mystery of his disappearance, but for the joy and light he had brought to his family and community. Neighbors supported one another during this time. People delivered meals, sat with grieving parents, and helped them with daily tasks. The tragedy, though heavy, brought out acts of kindness that showed the resilience of the human spirit. In their darkest time, the families were reminded that they were not alone. As months passed, the FBI concluded its official investigation. Though Father Doyle could no longer be questioned, the evidence painted a clear picture. He had lived a double life: one as a respected leader, the other as a man hiding unthinkable secrets. The final report was delivered to the families with as much compassion as possible. It did not erase their loss, but it did answer the question that had haunted them for so long: what happened to their sons? The town slowly began to heal. It was not an easy process. The church bell, which once brought comfort, now carried a different sound for many. But over time, people learned to separate their faith from the actions of one man. Some families returned to services, holding on to their belief in God even as they struggled with anger toward the institution. Others chose to build their spiritual lives outside the church, finding peace in private prayers or small gatherings. For the younger generation, the case became a lesson. Teachers spoke about it in schools, reminding students of the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. Parents used the story to teach their children about trust, awareness, and courage. The Altar Boys of 1980 became not only a memory but a reminder that truth, though buried, will always find its way to the surface. Years later, a memorial was built in the center of St. Mary's. It was simple yet powerful: 11 small stones arranged in a circle, each one engraved with the name of a boy who had vanished. Families and visitors came often, leaving flowers, notes, and photographs. The memorial became a place of reflection, where people could remember the lives lost and find strength in the community's resilience. Though the pain never fully disappeared, the families of the boys learned to live with it. They found comfort in knowing that their children's stories had not been forgotten, that their lives had meaning beyond the tragedy. They became advocates for truth and transparency, speaking at events, encouraging others never to remain silent, and reminding the world that healing begins with honesty. The story of the 11 altar boys and the secrets hidden in a priest's coffin became part of history. Books were written, documentaries were made, and journalists continued to revisit the case, each time uncovering new details or perspectives. But for the people of St. Mary's, it was not just history. It was their life, their grief, their lesson. And so, the town moved forward not by forgetting, but by remembering. The children who had once stood proudly at the altar were now remembered in every prayer, every vigil, and every whispered story told to future generations. Their absence had changed everything, but their memory continued to inspire courage, resilience, and the pursuit of truth. In the end, the case of the missing altar boys proved one undeniable truth: secrets may rest in silence for years, but eventually, they rise to the surface. And when they do, they remind us all that even in the darkest places, the light of truth can never be fully buried.